A simple child, dear brother Jim, that lightly draws its breath, and feels its life in every limb, what should it know of death? Welcome to another episode of Sunday Morning Poetry on the Troubadour Podcast. Today we are going to cover the poem We Are Seven by William Wordsworth, continuing our exploration of lyrical ballads, 1798. Now, in exploring this book quite a bit, and at this point I've now, for myself, read all of the six great poets, the great works, most of the great works of the six great poets: William Blake, Wordsworth, Keats, Shelley, Byron, and of course Coleridge. I'm no expert, but I'm now starting to get a little bit more of an understanding of what the Romantic movement really was and what it was about and how it worked. And this is what we're starting to explore more. And one of the things that occurred to me, and just as a playful thought as I explored this, is who among these six were the greatest? Who is the greatest of all the Romantics? Who is the greatest of all the Romantic English poets? Is a more fair judgment. It's a little bit difficult to judge a William Blake against a Victor Hugo or an Edmond Rostand, because not only are they separated by different countries and different languages and somewhat different eras. William Blake was one of the oldest of all the Romantics, but Blake was actually a visual artist, a painter. So one of his most famous works is a painting called Newton, which you just have to see. Let me just to give you an idea of what he's creating here. And, Blake is doing many other great works of visual arts. In fact, he would engrave and create paintings for all of his poems, or for all of his major poems. And he created these very odd and awe-inspiring books that had these types of paintings in them, or plates, and he would draw along with his great poetry. And so he had a very interesting impact on the Romantic movement. And, again, he's with visual art as well as poetry. So William Blake has a deep impact on both of these. Now, I'm not an expert in paintings. I've definitely looked at a lot and inspected them to the best of my ability. But, for instance, the way he does musculature here is really unique, and it reminds me personally of one of his famous paintings of a dragon that I can't remember off the top of my head. It just popped in my head now, but I think it's just called Hannibal or some. The Red Dragon. So there's a movie called The Red Dragon, I think it is, with Hannibal Lecter. It's a prequel to Silence of the Lambs, and the guy thinks that he's an incarnation of the dragon that William Blake makes, and in fact, he actually goes into these archives and eats one of the, I don't know if it's an original or one of a famous, engraving or something like that. Like, he eats it because he thinks it's, he's imbibing it. That's part of who he is. Anyway, my point is that he, William Blake had poetry, he had, and he had painting. So it's hard to evaluate him in exact relation in terms of greatness and what we even mean by greatness in terms of someone like Victor Hugo. But we can definitely do this with the Romantics and with the Romantic poets. For instance, I think we could think about, well, let's say we want to focus on poetry itself, right? So William Blake had great poetry, but I think he's mostly a visual artist and a poet. And I think he's not quite as, he didn't have quite the impact that Wordsworth had overall in his poetry, and the influence to this day that Wordsworth had overall. Lord Byron had Childe Harold, which was a long epic poem. It's one of the few epic poems of this time that is like this style, although they all kind of wanted to and tried their hand at it. Wordsworth, for instance, tried his hand and created the Prelude, which is probably the pinnacle today for art historians or literary historians of what the literary Romantic movement of that time, the English Romantics, meant and what they were capable of. So there is something important about that element that Byron, that's his main thing that he's known for. He did other epic poems. He's mostly known, I think, as a romantic figure in a lot of ways. I mean, we think about the Byronic universe. Coleridge also is known primarily, he did the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is unprecedented in its overall impact on the movement. It, in a sense, launches the movement. He, along with Wordsworth, kind of launched the movement of Romanticism by lyrical ballads in 1798. Now, Shelley is an interesting figure too. He has some amazing short poems that are very impactful. I think one of his great works is Prometheus Unbound, which is almost an answer to Aeschylus's poem, drama, I should say, of ancient Greece called Prometheus Bound. And it is, Prometheus Unbound, which was, I think, impossible to produce as a play. Again, all the English romantics of this era wanted to create their own kind of drama like this. He was the only one who did, but it was somewhat unproducible to some degree. I think we get the great playwright, although there's many playwrights in this era. I think one of the greatest comes a lot later, Edmond Rostand. Now, if we're going to evaluate pure poetry, I think it personally, at this point in my understanding, I think it comes down to Keats and Wordsworth. And, so I've thought about them a lot, and I've thought about their corresponding differences. They're quite different in a lot of ways. Keats, for instance, is much more interested in mythology and in the mythology that's already been passed down to him, whereas Wordsworth is quite a bit more original in a lot of ways. He wants to create his own mythology. He wants to create what Milton did with religion of Christianity. He wants to create his own Christianity in a sense. Like, he wants to create his own religion and the mythology that goes along with it. So, I mean, he's a bit of a bigger thinker than Keats in a lot of ways. And Keats is not a deep thinker in the sense that Wordsworth is, or as profound, at least not in his ambition that I can see. However, the interesting thing about these two characters, if we think of them as two of the pure poets of the big six romantic poets, is that, to put this in perspective of the differences in terms of their lifespan and what they accomplished in their lifespan, were Wordsworth to have died at the same age that Keats died, we never would have heard of Wordsworth. So just to give you an example, just so you understand, Keats died at 25 years old, having accomplished obviously everything that he had written up to that point, all the great works that he had written. And there's a 2-year period in his life that's considered one of the most productive periods in English literary history, period. And in all, had Keats or had Wordsworth died at 25, then we never would have had Lyrical Ballads, which he published when he was almost 29. So that's a big difference. Now, on the other hand, Wordsworth paved the way, we could say, because he was quite a bit older than Keats. He was born in 1770. So Keats was born in 1795. So he was 15 years younger than Wordsworth, and Wordsworth had, in a big way, paved the way for Keats to accomplish a lot of what he did by creating the style, the movement, the ideas behind it, working with Coleridge to really express the ideas. He had gone through, by the time Keats starts to rise in the late 19, 20, 21, and that era, that couple years, this is when Wordsworth and Coleridge, but especially Wordsworth, has really become an increasing influence by this point. He's become much more powerful. People believe in him. People agree with him. People, start to see his method of creating poetry a little bit more by this point. Now, so, in my estimation of evaluating the greatest of these poets, it's kind of difficult, and I think it's similar to trying to ask which part of the Pacific Ocean is the wettest. So I'm not sure it's even really fully possible. I think you can develop certain standards. But one thing I wanted to say is that to lead into our poem, We Are Seven, one of the many advantages that Wordsworth had, besides survival, which is a pretty big advantage because it allows him to create works that, Keats just didn't have time for. And there is something about Keats's work that's very haunting, that kind of, I think the fact that he died early, and many of the poets like Byron and Shelley died very early, and Coleridge died somewhat early too. It was really only Wordsworth and Byron who lived into much older age. And, there's something about that almost feeds into our view of when we say he's romantic, right? Not romantic in terms of bringing flowers, but there's a kind of romanticism to his life, that he lives high with emotion and passion and he dies. So it's always, very considered when we think of being romantic as very impractical. It's all emotion and passion and no practicality, right? And that, you can't survive that way. You can't live, burning the candle on both ends kind of idea. And there is some truth to the way that he had that. Now, in terms of that view, but it's not fully correct and it's not really fair. And that's what we're trying to explore here. These poets had a very firm and staunch belief in their own form of reason and what they thought was reason and how the imagination worked with reason. But they were very staunch reasonable people. They believed the senses were critical. In fact, Wordsworth, the main epic poem that was going to be his life work, called The Recluse, which he never finished. He created parts of it, like the prelude. There's a segment of The Recluse called The Excursion that he published, and it's considered one of the great works and one of Keats's favorite works, by the way. And in these works, and what he's trying to do, and what he and Coleridge had envisioned with this, and it was Coleridge's first plan, and he kind of supplanted it on Wordsworth because he realized Wordsworth was the much greater poet, which is true. One of the ways and one of the things that he was going to do was going to create segments for each of the five senses. So there was going to be a whole way of how to integrate from hearing, a whole, epic segment on, the eyes and the observing of the world and integrating those into concepts. And same thing with taste and with smell and with touch, all of the five senses. That was going to be their religion. It's just taking the five senses, the five pathways to reason, as they put it, and to integrate that through the imagination. Imagination to them was the integrating faculty for all of these things. And that is, that was the work that they were trying to develop. And there was something very grand and epic. And so reason is such a critical part that we don't talk about with the Romantics, and yet they talked about a lot. It was very important to them. But what they were rebelling against, all of the Romantics, was rationalism, was the rationalism and of the classicism that came before them, where you had to be, it was basically what it amounted to was authoritarianism, is that these rules are set down, and this is how you're supposed to do. And they're saying, no, we need to look out and then think for ourselves. And that's really a big part of what they were fighting for, and passion to them was actually a manifestation of being human. And so, you still need to live by experiencing your own life because it's the only one you got. Now, one advantage that Wordsworth had, one advantage Wordsworth had over Keats, for instance, was that he lived long and that he actually experienced life in a way that Wordsworth didn't, or Keats didn't. Keats sat in his room a lot. He pined away for, his neighbor girl a lot. He wrote epic poems, or, these grand poems that were based on art that other people created. And it's kind of almost an homage to them. And it's a mythology that he's admiring from the past. Now, at the age of 20, early 20s, mid 20s, before Wordsworth writes the lyrical ballads, he is he is writing. He's been writing since he was a kid, just like Keats does. No great poet just comes out of nowhere. He's been writing poetry. He's done a lot of, good poetry for his age. He's always considered a good poet for his age, but he hasn't come into his own until he's, in his late 20s. And really much later than that, he's not considered a great poet in his own life. until he's in his 40s, 50s, and then above, and then he becomes a poet laureate of England. But when he's young, he actually goes to France during the Revolution. He meets a French aristocratic woman named Annette Vallon. He impregnates her. They have a kid. And during the Reign of Terror, 1793, she's an aristocrat. He's a Republican. He actually writes letters in favor of republicanism. He's, and this is very detrimental to him financially over the course of his life, or at least over the next 15 years or so. And, so he does this during this turbulent time of his life. He's experiencing life in a way that Keats never got to, and never did, because he was too sickly in his life. And so he's seeing all these things, and he's going on walking tours all over the place. And at the time that Keats is writing these amazing poets in emulation of mythology from the past, for instance, Wordsworth is living. And what Wordsworth's poems amount to are observations of his incidents and events in real life, a life that Keats never had. And this is one of the ways that I think the poetry and the language is much more real, but also romantic, in a way that Keats is a stereotypical, purely romantic, where there's no, it's all about, myths of great heroes of the past, or just, a butterfly, for instance, or that represents the soul from ancient Greece. That's not, and there's a certain Suke model of this old school, or this myth from thousands of years ago that hasn't been properly revered. So he creates the reverence that he's going to create by creating a model in his mind, or a temple in his mind for this. This is the kind of poetry that he does. It's a lot about that. Not all of it, of course. There's other things, but that's a big part of it. Wordsworth he goes out in the world. He meets individuals. As you've seen when we explore this, there's real incidents that these are based on. And that's where he creates his poetry. As he said, Wordsworth said, poetry is an overflow of emotion recollected in tranquility. And of course, Keats did not have that. Now, in 1793, the Reign of Terror, Wordsworth is going on a walking tour, among one of the things, and many seeds for future poems are placed in his mind. He doesn't have the, he's not writing a ton right now, but he's living in a lot of the seeds that are going to happen. So, for instance, how he thinks about it is there were incidents and images, right? This is events and things he saw, which then impress themselves on his mind to be mulled over in future years, recollected in tranquility, and subtly infused with his own imaginative coloring. So, for instance, while on a walking tour, he met a pretty little girl, about 8 years old, who insisted she was one of 7 children, even though 2 of her siblings were dead. Her refusal to accept that she was now one of 5 led William to write "We Are 7" as an illustration of children's inability to grasp death. Now, if you remember from last week, Anecdote for Fathers, we did something somewhat similar where we looked at, the view of a child's psychology and consciousness and context. And that's another one that Wordsworth is thinking about here. So in exploring this poem today, I think we want to put into perspective that this is a real incident. He ran into a girl like this, and then just like many of his poems, he then infuses it, or he puts it through the forge of his imaginative consciousness and comes out with the beautiful language, the simplistic, in a sense, everyday language, more everyday than most great poets that we are going to see here. So let's do a reading of this and then let's talk about it. We Are 7 by William Wordsworth. A simple child that lightly draws its breath and feels its life in every limb, what should it know of death? I met a little girl. She was 8 years old. She said, Her hair was thick, with many a curl that clustered round her head. She had a rustic woodland air, and she was wildly clad. Her eyes were fair and very fair. Her beauty made me glad. Sisters and brothers, little maid, how many may you be? How many? 7 in all, she said, and wondering looked at me. And where are they, I pray you tell? She answered, 7 are we, and 2 of us at Conway dwell, and 2 of us are gone to sea. 2 of us in the churchyard lie, my sister and my brother. And in the churchyard cottage I dwell near them with my mother. You say that 2 at Conway dwell, and 2 are gone to sea, yet ye are 7? I pray you tell, sweet maid, how this may be. Then did the little maid reply, 7 boys and girls are we. 2 of us in the churchyard lie, beneath the churchyard tree. You run about, my little maid, your limbs they are alive. If 2 are in the churchyard laid, then ye are only 5. Their graves are green, they may be seen, the little maid replied. 12 steps or more from my mother's door, and they are side by side. My stockings there I often knit, my kerchief there I hem, and there upon the ground I sit, and sing a song to them. And often after sunset, sir, when it is light and fair, I take my little porringer, and eat my supper there. The first that died was Sister Jane, in bed she moaning lay, till God released her of her pain, and then she went away. So in the churchyard she was laid, and when the grass was dry, together round her grave we played, my brother John and I. And when the ground was white with snow, and I could run and slide, my brother John was forced to go, and he lies by her side. How many are you then? Said I, if they 2 are in heaven. Quick was the little maid's reply, Oh, master, we are 7. But they are dead, those 2 are dead, their spirits are in heaven. 'Twas throwing words away, for still the little maid would have her will, and said, Nay, we are 7. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed that. I did make 1 or 2 mistakes, I apologize, but we'll read through it slowly, stanza by stanza. I think it's a pretty simple poem in terms of what the words are saying. I mean, you kind of should get it, and you have this indication that when you have this long line or a pause at the beginning here, this definitely, if you're watching on Facebook, YouTube, or troubadourmag.com, you can see there's this dash, this long dash. It's like a extended M dash. Starts off a simple child, which kind of indicates it starts in the middle of a thought. You know, it's almost like you're walking and you're thinking about, oh, look at that. Ooh, a simple child. You know, it's like, oh, well, who's this simple child, right? And you just kind of it's almost like your thought was interrupted, and oh, here we're beginning this poem. So it starts, a simple child that lightly draws its breath and feels its life in every limb. What should it know of death? Now, this, you know, one way I've tried to help you in terms of reading poetry when you're not familiar with it is, especially something like Wordsworth, is everything is very conscious. He knows this is going to be your first experience with this poem. And so, like many poems before it, in a kind of almost a sonnet way, is it sets up what the poem is about. So it's about a simple child, that's the subject. A simple child that lightly draws its breath and feels its life in every limb, right? When you see young children, 7, 8 years old, they're so full of energy. It feels like this is the embodiment of what we mean when we say life with a capital L, right? When we distinguish between, are you living or just existing, right? Like, are you just breathing and eating food and going to the bathroom and sleeping, and that's your life? Or are you really alive, right? What do we mean when we say that, right? Alive, right? It's alive. What do we mean by that? And a child really embodies that. It's, you know, they're jumping around, they're excited. Sometimes you want them to calm down, but they won't calm down. And so there's life in every limb, right? And it just is kind of coursing through a child. So what should it know of death? Like you would think that a child, just by looking at it, is farther from death than anything, right? The older you get, the closer to death you become. Now he goes into his poem into his story in the second stanza. So the first stanza, he sees this simple child. It invokes this thought of, like you're looking at this child, and if you're a contemplative person, you might think, well, how could any child ever die? Right? Like, how could any child ever think of death? I mean, look at the life that's in this, and I could never imagine what it would be like to lose a child, but that part of it, it's always horrible. But when you see a little child that's just so full of life, and then, think about it gone, that child, it's just a crazy thought. Partly, I think, because of its distance visually from death. I met a cottage girl. So it's an ordinary peasant girl. I met a little cottage girl. She was 8 years old, she said. Her hair was thick with many a curl that clustered round her head. So again, he's emphasizing visuals that show the kind of person she is. She's this curly-haired little girl. It's probably just in disarray, kind of curly hair. It's clustered around her head. It's kind of, bashed around there. And she had a rustic woodland air. She was wildly clad. Her eyes were fair and very fair. Her beauty made me glad. So she's kind of a wood nymph. This is, this is again a big difference between him and Keats, is he uses the kind of imagery from ancient, mythology of like, little wood nymphs and just woodland fairies dancing around that you might see if you read Homer or something, or an ancient Greek play. But he's not calling it that. He's not talking about that. He's just using the visuals. He's just saying that though, it's kind of implying that those ancient stories, those mythologies, are based on people like me back then who saw these creatures and imagined something about them and then said some great truth. So that's what Wordsworth's kind of mission is. The difference is that he doesn't rely on them. He's creating it anew, as in the world is starting anew with Wordsworth. That's what, he's considered, by the way, very egotistical in his work and in his life, his demeanor and everything, which I take to be a pretty good thing about him, is that, for him, the world starts with him, right? And he's going to create that world for everybody else. And his world's going to be the best. So she had a rustic woodland air, like a wood nymph, and she was wildly clad, right? You could imagine twigs in her hair. Maybe she's a little bit dusty. Her eyes, though, were fair. Her eyes were fair and very fair. Her beauty made me glad. So he likes looking upon her. She's a cute little girl. Sisters and brothers, this is a quote. Sisters and brothers, little maid, how many may you be? How many others like you are there? How many? She says. How many? 7 in all, she said, and wondering looked at me. And where are they? I pray you tell. She answered, 7 are we, and 2 of us at Conway dwell, that's a location, and 2 are gone to sea. So 2 have left, probably older brothers or sisters. 2 of us in the churchyard lie. Churchyard, why would they lie in the churchyard? Because they're under, the ground, they're dead. My sister and my brother. And in the churchyard cottage, I dwell near them with my mother. You say that 2 at Conway dwell, and 2 are gone to sea, yet ye are 7? I pray you tell, sweet maid, how this may be. Then did the little maid reply, 7 boys and girls are we. 2 of us in the churchyard lie, beneath the churchyard tree. It's almost like she's speaking to an idiot, right? Then did the little maid reply, just very simply, she just answers, so he says, he asks a question in a sense, although it's a statement, but he asks a question. You say that 2 at Conway dwell and 2 are gone to sea? Okay, that's 4. You're 5, yet ye are 7. I pray you tell, sweet maid, how this may be. And then did the little maid reply, 7 boys and girls are we. 2 of us in the churchyard lie, beneath the churchyard tree. Like it's just common sense. You run about, my little maid, your limbs, they are alive, right? He's stuck on this limbs thing, right? She's moving, and of course, a coffin. Your hands are your hands are like on your chest or at your side or something, and they're very stiff. Yet she is the opposite of that. Your limbs, they are alive. If two are in the churchyard laid, then ye are only 5. Their graves are green, they may be seen, the little maid replied. 12 steps or more from my mother's door, and they are side by side. Now he's breaking his kind of rhythm of you run about, my little maid, if two are in the churchyard laid, their graves are green, they may be seen. So she's emphasizing here 12 steps or more from my mother's door. That's one line. So, she's making an emphasis again, kind of just stating the obvious. Their graves are green, they may be seen. So it's like I can still see them. They exist, they're right there. She's not connecting what he's trying to talk about in terms of life and death. Their graves are green, they may be seen, the little maid replied. They're only 12 steps or more from my mother's door, and they are side by side. So they're together, right? They're closer to her than the brothers that are, or the siblings that are out at sea, or the ones that are farther away at Conway dwell. My stockings there I often knit, my kerchief there I hem. So she's knitting and working side by side with her brothers or her brother and sister that are only 12 steps from her door. My stockings there I often knit, my kerchief there I hem, and there upon the ground I sit, and sing a song to them. And often after sunset, sir, when it is light and fair, I take my little porringer and eat my supper there. So again, she has two siblings out at sea. She has two siblings far away at another town, and her two siblings that are dead are right next to her. So to her, the siblings that are right next to her are closer and more real than the ones that are out at sea and at another location. The first that died was Sister Jane. In bed she moaning lay, till God released her of her pain, and then she went away. So in the churchyard she was laid, and when the grass was dry, together round her grave we played, my brother John and I. So, she acknowledges that the sister Jane was moaning, and God released her pain, and she went away. So there is a sense where she went away, but she went away 12 steps from them. So in the churchyard she was laid, and when the grass was dry, her brother John, so it's Jane and John, pretty plain Jane names, my brother John and Jane, and they kind of dancing around, not that there's anything wrong if your name is Jane or John. And when the ground was white with snow, and I could run and slide, my brother John was forced to go, and he that lies by her side. So, it's kind of like, oh, he had to go too, he couldn't play anymore, he's lying there now as well. How many are you then, said I, if they too are in heaven? Quick was the little maid's reply. Oh, master, we are 7. Right? She's still like, are you daft? Are you slow? What's wrong with you? Right? If you've ever counteracted what a young child knows to be true, right? Like if they're taught their ABCs and you try to mash it up and say, you're FCDs or something, and they'd be like, what? You're crazy. It's ABCs. You know what that. Like, what are you? You're so stupid. Like that's how they kind of will talk to you if you counteract something that they know to be certain in their little minds. Oh, master, we are 7, but they are dead. Those 2 are dead. Their spirits are in heaven. 'Twas throwing words away, for still the little maid would have her will, and said, nay, we are 7. Now, I think the totality of this poem, again, a very simple poem, and it was very well received in its time. Actually, it's one of the poems in the 1798 lyrical ballads that was well received. And I think why, again, is you have a simplicity, you have this experience, and it doesn't have some kind of pure or necessarily a super profound message, but there is something very subtle going on in there where this girl is refusing to agree or understand, or she's incapable of really understanding what's happening in terms of the death of her brother and sister, that she understands that they, quote unquote, went away, right? She understands that they're not in the same form that they were when she met them, but to her, they still live, they still exist, they're still part of her family. And again, if you think about the two brothers that, or the two siblings that went to sea, so how does it go? It says, 7 are we, and 2 of us at Conway dwell. That's just the location. And 2 are gone to sea. So those 4 are farther away from her and her reality than the observation of these 2 that lie in the church. And this to Wordsworth was really impactful because it was saying that she was saying in her own way that she didn't understand fully what death was, or maybe he doesn't. If you're a religious person, you might think of they're never really gone. They're always, it's sure the body's dead, but the spirit is there. God took the, Jane and John, but she's really right here with me. So the poem, like a lot of Wordsworth poems, is very subtly, has a subtle morality to it. I think it goes back to, in this case, the beginning of the poem, which starts a simple child that lightly draws it. It's emphasizing as much as you can emphasize that it's a simple child. So it's not, it's wisdom in children, which is a very romantic notion. It comes again from Rousseau, who believed that savages and children left to their own devices were actually better off than civilized man at that time. And I think this unfortunate idea, which is nonsense, but this unfortunate idea spread into the English Romantics and in throughout all of Romanticism. And you see that in a lot of the poetry, and you see that here when he sees this child and he thinks that there must be something profound in what she's saying. And, in a sense, there is something interesting about it, that this child, in terms of learning child psychology and what it means to be a child and how a child experiences the world. And in this case, she experiences the world as that she's one of 7. They're not gone just because, they're not in your face right now. Like, she can play with them. She can eat food with them. She can sing with them, or to them at least, all the things she did when they were moving around and God had not taken them. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that. Stick around tomorrow for Metaphysical Mondays, where we're going to do another poem by John Donne. And also, we have a special announcement is and myself and Jeff Britting, the former archivist of the Ayn Rand Institute. He helped build the Ayn Rand Institute. He's worked in Hollywood for over 30 years as well. He's an Academy Award nominated composer or for a film that he helped compose and edit and worked on. And so we sat down and we're experimenting with a new show that I'd love to get your feedback on. It's called Peering at Things. And the general concept is we're going to look at an object, a piece of a manuscript, a picture, and we're going to talk about its influence and importance then and now, how it impacted that era, whether it was 50, 60, 70 years ago, like we did this last Sunday. That's now released on troubadourmag.com. You can see the episode where we talked about a 1950s picture of James Dean waiting around in Hollywood for a role. And the movie, actually, we went into a long discussion. I think you'll find interesting, especially if you saw the movie Once Upon a Time in Hollywood by Quentin Tarantino. So we talked about that. And we're going to, hopefully, if you like this show, we're going to do more of these types of things where we'll kind of play with some image. And we hope to do a manuscript from Ayn Rand to, about writers, something that's not generally popular or not as much known. And we're going to look at this little page and we're going to talk about that. So stick around for that. Go to troubadourmag.com, sign up, share this, help us spread the word. We're not charging you any money for any of this stuff. So help spread the word about all the content we're creating about great literature and how to make it accessible to everyone. Okay. Thank you very much for Sunday Morning Poetry, and I'll see you next time.